The Pacific Theater. 1945. An island fortress. American forces advancing. Japanese defenders surrounded. No supplies. No reinforcements. No hope. And yet, they didn't surrender. Not when the situation became desperate. Not when ammunition ran low. Not when comrades fell beside them. They fought. To the last man. To the last bullet. To the last breath. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was the pattern. Island after island. Battle after battle. Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. The story repeated itself. American commanders were baffled. Why wouldn't they surrender? Why choose certain death over captivity? What could drive men to such extremes? The answer wasn't simple. It wasn't one thing. It was layers. Culture, training, belief, fear. All woven together into something powerful. Something that turned ordinary men into fanatics. Let's start at the foundation. Bushido. The way of the warriors. An ancient code. Dating back centuries. To the samurai era. But here's what most people get wrong. The Bushido that influenced World War II soldiers. It wasn't the original. It was a reconstruction. A modernized version. Weaponized for nationalism. The Meiji Restoration changed everything. Japan opened to the West. Modernized rapidly. Built a military empire. And they needed a warrior ethos. Something to bind soldiers. Something uniquely Japanese. So they reached back. To the samurai. To Bushido. But they twisted it. Reshaped it. Made it serve the state. Original Bushido was complex. It valued honor, yes. Loyalty, yes. But also wisdom. Benevolence. Righteousness. The militarized version was simpler. Harsher. More absolute. Loyalty to the emperor above all. Death before dishonor. Surrender equals shame. This wasn't just taught. It was drilled. Hammered into consciousness. From childhood onward. Schools became indoctrination centers. Children learned that dying for Japan was the highest honor. That the emperor was divine. That serving him was life's only purpose. Military training intensified everything. Basic training in the Imperial Japanese Army was brutal. Deliberately brutal. Designed to break men down. Then rebuild them. Recruits were beaten regularly. By officers. By senior soldiers. Sometimes for mistakes. Often for no reason at all. The message was clear. Your body isn't yours. Your life isn't yours. Everything belongs to the emperor. Pain was normalized. Suffering was expected. Complaining was unthinkable. They learned the Senjinkan, the military field code, issued in 1941. It was explicit, crystal clear. Do not live in shame as a prisoner. By dying, you will avoid leaving behind the crime of a stain on your honor. Not suggestions. Orders. Surrender wasn't presented as an option. It was presented as the ultimate betrayal. Worse than death. Worse than anything. And there were consequences. Not just for the individual. For the family. Japanese society operated on collective shame. Your actions reflected on everyone. Your parents. Your siblings. Your entire village. A soldier who surrendered. He disgraced them all. His family would face ostracism. Social death. They might lose jobs. lose standing, be treated as pariahs. Military police visited families of captured soldiers, interrogated them, implied complicity, created atmosphere of suspicion. Some families held funeral ceremonies for sons who were captured, treating them as dead because socially they were. This created enormous pressure. Soldiers knew what surrender meant, not just for them, for everyone they loved. Death in battle was honorable. It brought glory to the family. The soldier's name would be honored, his family respected. Surrender brought only shame, unending shame, generational shame. Given that choice, many chose death. But there's more. The propaganda machine was relentless. Japanese soldiers were told things about the enemy. Terrible things. That Americans were savages. That they tortured prisoners, committed atrocities, showed no mercy. Some of this came from projection. Japanese forces had committed atrocities in China, throughout Asia. They assumed the enemy would reciprocate. Soldiers were told that capture meant torture, mutilation, slow death. So why surrender? If capture meant agony anyway, better to die fighting, better to control your own end. Some chose suicide over capture. Grenades, bayonets, whatever was available. Officers often killed wounded soldiers, rather than leave them to be captured, presented as mercy, as honor. The reality of American treatment, often far better than they'd been told. But by the time soldiers learned this, it was too late. The beliefs were set, the conditioning complete. Let's talk about battlefield dynamics. Japanese military doctrine emphasized offense, aggressive action, attack spirit. Defense was seen as passive, weak, un-Japanese. This created tactical problems, but it reinforced the death before surrender mentality. Banzai charges became infamous. Suicidal frontal assaults, often at night, with bayonets. They rarely succeeded militarily. But that wasn't entirely the point. They demonstrated spirit, commitment, willingness to die. For Japanese commanders, this mattered, sometimes more than tactical success. The divine wind, kamikaze, the ultimate expression of this philosophy. Pilots who flew planes into ships, deliberately, no return journey, one-way missions. This shocked Americans, seemed incomprehensible. What could drive such sacrifice? But within the Japanese military framework, it made sense. These pilots were volunteers. Mostly, they believed they were saving Japan, that their deaths had meaning, would turn the tide. They were celebrated, honored before deaths, promised glory, eternal remembrance. For young men raised in this culture, taught that dying for the emperor was the highest calling. It was logical, almost inevitable. Now consider the late war situation. By 1944, Japan was losing badly, resources depleted, navy shattered, air force decimated, supply lines cut. Rational analysis said the war was lost. But surrender, unthinkable, not for the military leadership, not for the soldiers. So they fought on, even when hopeless, perhaps especially when hopeless, because if defeat was certain, then dying well was all that remained. The last measure of honor. Island garrisons were cut off. No evacuation possible. No reinforcement coming. They knew this. Everyone knew. But they defended anyway. Turned islands into fortresses. Built elaborate tunnel systems. Prepared for final stands. Iwo Jima. 21,000 Japanese defenders. Only 216 captured. Most of those too wounded to resist. The rest fought until killed. Okinawa was worse. 70,000 Japanese military dead. Perhaps 40,000 Okinawan civilians. Many chose suicide over capture. Families jumped from cliffs together, rather than face American occupation. The propaganda had worked too well. Here's the psychological dimension. Group pressure is powerful in any military, but in the Japanese system, it was overwhelming. Soldiers lived in tight units, watched each other constantly. Any weakness was noted, any hesitation punished. To suggest surrender, to express doubt, unthinkable. The group enforced conformity, through violence if necessary. Officers sometimes shot soldiers who wavered. Publicly, as examples, wounded soldiers who couldn't continue, given grenades, expected to end themselves, so they wouldn't burden the unit. This created a closed system. No escape, no alternative. You fought, or you died by your own side's hand. Some soldiers did surrender. Eventually, toward war's end, when positions became completely untenable. But even then, many couldn't. The conditioning was too deep. The shame too great. The fear too overwhelming. Some Japanese soldiers hid. For years, on Pacific islands, unaware the war had ended, or unable to accept it. The last known holdout, Teruo Nakamura, surrendered in 1974, nearly 30 years after the war ended. He'd been hiding on an Indonesian island, alone, for decades. What does that tell you about the power of this conditioning? That a man would rather live alone in the jungle for 30 years than face the shame of surrender. The legacy of this is complex. Japanese soldiers' refusal to surrender. It prolonged battles, increased casualties on both sides. It contributed to American decisions, like using atomic bombs. The calculation was partly based on this. If Japan had to be invaded, if every soldier fought to the death, if civilians did the same, the casualties would be catastrophic. Millions dead, on both sides. The bombs were horror, but the alternative seemed worse. After the war, Japan changed dramatically. The militaristic culture was dismantled. Bushido reinterpreted again, or abandoned. Modern Japan is pacifist. Constitutional limits on military. Different values, different priorities. But the memory remains of what happened, of what men were driven to do. So why did Japanese soldiers fight to the death? Not one reason. Many reasons, all reinforcing. Cultural conditioning from childhood. Brutal military training. Code that made surrender unthinkable. Shame that extended to families. Propaganda about enemy atrocities. Group pressure from fellow soldiers. Tactical doctrine emphasizing aggression. Late war desperation. And underneath it all, a system that valued death over dishonor. That made suicide seem rational. That turned men into weapons, It wasn't just about being brave, or committed, or patriotic. It was about being trapped in a psychological cage, built from culture, training, fear, and shame, with only one way out: death. That's why they fought to the last. Not because they were naturally more fierce, not because of some racial characteristic, but because they were shaped deliberately, systematically, into men who couldn't surrender, even when they wanted to, even when it made no sense. The human mind is malleable. Given the right pressure, the right conditioning, the right circumstances, you can make people do almost anything, believe almost anything, even embrace their own death. That's the real lesson. Not about Japanese soldiers specifically, but about what systems can do to people. When ideology becomes absolute, when shame is weaponized, when death is glorified, this is what happens. Men fight to the death, not because they want to, but because they cannot imagine doing otherwise.